The new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine will be Mykhailo Drapatyi.
The presidential decree has been signed, and now I can finally say it officially. Vladimir Zelensky has dismissed Alexander Syrskyi, and the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine is now Major General Mykhailo Drapatyi. You could say that in the end the protesters won out. Today, on July 21, in his evening address, Vladimir Zelensky announced what protesters outside the president's office had been demanding for 6 days in a row. General Alexander Syrskyi has been dismissed from the position of Commander-in-Chief. The new Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine is Major General Mykhailo Drapatyi, the commander of the Joint Forces. Along with Syrskyi, the Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Andriy Hanatov, is also leaving. This is exactly what, let me remind you, Mykhailo Fedorov demanded back when he was just being appointed Minister of Defense. The decrees have already been signed and importantly published on the website of the President of Ukraine. Essentially, this is an extremely rare case during the entire full-scale war. Full-scale war, and probably the war as a whole, when peaceful protests by citizens directly changed the personnel decision of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Let me remind you that some deputies were completely against such a scenario. People came out for the return of Fedorov, for the dismissal of Syrskyi, and importantly for the appointment of Drapatyi as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And they got exactly what they stood for. Let's try now, without getting too emotional, to figure out who Mykhailo Drapatyi is and why his appointment is a victory for the Ukrainian army. What scandals were hanging over Syrskyi and what was ultimately offered to Mykhailo Fedorov? Because this is a position that in the West is called the Miltech Tsar. In fact, this is a position that has much more authority than the country's Minister of Defense. But in Ukraine, in the political context, this position is perceived as more like a minder role, and this connotation is not going to appeal to many people. Well, let's discuss how the entire defense apparatus of Ukraine will function now. My name is Drapatyi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're moving towards the milestone of 300,000 subscribers, so I would appreciate your personal subscription. And I'll note that we talked about Syrskyi definitely being removed back on July 18th. That is 3 days before it actually happened. So I think it's definitely worth subscribing. On May 9, 2014, Mykhailo Drapatyi was commanding the 2nd Mechanized Battalion of the 72nd Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which received the order to break through to the captured police headquarters in the city of Mariupol and help free the hostages. It was the IFV from his unit that literally flew over the barricades set up by supporters of the Russian world ideology. And the video became one of the symbols of the beginning of the war, and it was Drapatyi who was the commander of the crew of that very IFV in Mariupol. Drapatyi is the officer who went through the entire war and gradually became a general, but let's not get ahead of ourselves and talk about everything in order. I'll start with the very decision of the President of Ukraine. Zelensky announced it in his evening address on Tuesday against the backdrop of 6 days of protests. The president said literally, "I have decided that the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine will be Mykhailo Drapatyi." The president also confirmed that along with Syrskyi, his friend Lieutenant General Andriy Hanatov is stepping down from the position of Chief of the General Staff. Zelensky also stated that together with Drapatyi as well as Yevhen Kamara and Pavlo Polisa, they have determined how the entire configuration of the General Staff of the armed forces of Ukraine should be updated. In other words, it's not just about replacing one person, that is Syrskyi, with Drapatyi, but about restructuring the entire military leadership, Hennedy.
I have decided that the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine will be Mykhailo Drapatyi. Together with Mykhailo, Yevgeny Kamara, and Pavlo Polisa, we have determined what the updated configuration of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine should be.
At the same time, Zelensky acted diplomatically, carefully, and did not pile on the outgoing General Syrskyi. He openly acknowledged his achievements, and the president stated as a fact that it was Syrskyi who secured Ukraine's successes in the defense of Kyiv, the Kharkiv offensive operation, and the Kursk operation. So Zelensky still gave him credit. Syrskyi really did save the capital in 2022, and no one can take that away.
The fact is that Oleksandr Syrskyi secured Ukraine's successes in the defense of Kiev, the Kharkiv offensive operation, and the Kursk operation. A great deal has been accomplished. The defense of Ukraine continues, and every soldier deserves respect. I am grateful to Oleksandr Syrskyi and every one of our soldiers for Ukraine's strong frontline positions.
However, the president also acknowledged the root of the problem. According to him, Defense Minister Fedorov and Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi could not find common ground, and problems on the battlefield in the brigades and, importantly, with mobilization remained unresolved. This acknowledgement, in my opinion, is key. President Zelensky, in fact, confirmed what the streets and the protests have been saying for 6 days. The old structure wasn't working, and it should have been changed a long time ago.
I'm grateful to Mykhailo Drapatyi for exactly this perspective. Today, Oleksandr Syrskyi, Andriy Ignatov, and I talked about their future roles and the proper handover of responsibilities.
But who is Mykhailo Drapatyi, and why did the protesters demand that he be appointed as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine and not someone else? Mykhailo Drapatyi is 43 years old. He is a major general, a professional military officer, and a tank specialist by education. And what is fundamentally important is that he worked his way up from the bottom, starting from a battalion, and did not go straight into a comfortable high-level headquarters position after university. Let me go over his biography because this is a real biography, the biography of a true combat commander. The beginning of the war, that is the year 2014, May 9, 2014. As we have already established, Mykhailo Drapatyi was in command of the 2nd Mechanized Battalion of the 72nd Brigade. The battalion received the order to break through to the seized police headquarters in Mariupol and help free the hostages who had been taken by the Russians. And here is the moment that became a symbol of the beginning of the war, the IFV. His unit literally flies over the barricade of supporters of the Russian world ideology. The video of this breakthrough spread all over Ukraine, and I would even say all over the world, and became one of the symbols of the beginning of the war. And here is that very IFV flying in Mariupol with Drapatyi at the wheel. I'm not sure if you say at the wheel or at the controls of an IFV. If you know, let me know in the comments. And that same summer of 2014, unfortunately, the Izvarino encirclement happened. And so Drapatyi took on the task of organizing the breakout of Ukrainian units from the encirclement near Izvarino and Chervonopartizansk. And according to official data, his group led out about 260 servicemen and more than 30 pieces of equipment fighting their way for over 160 kilometers. They fought their way out of the encirclement over 160 kilometers. Drapatyi had a call sign. The call sign was Rubin. After the events of 2014, he returned to the front as the Chief of Staff of the 30th Mechanized Brigade. Although, why did I say that he went from the very bottom to the very top even though he could have taken a different path? Although he could have easily continued his studies at the military university and not returned to the front line at all. That is, he chose the front line, not the office, even though he could have chosen the office right away. In 2021, in that year, Drapatyi was recognized as the best graduate at the operational strategic level of the National Defense University. And the British ambassador, Melinda Simmons, presented him with the Queen's Trophy Sword. This is a prestigious award for the best graduate. From the very first minutes of the full-scale war, Drapatyi was commanding the troops in the south. The Kakhovka group under his command was liberating settlements in the Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk regions. They advanced, breaking into the Russian defenses. For this, he was awarded the Cross of Combat Merit. In 2024, it was Drapatyi who was sent to save Kharkiv. And during the Russian offensive in the north of Kharkiv region, Drapatyi led the Kharkiv Operational Tactical Group, and here is a direct assessment from Zelensky himself. Quote, actually not a quote. The president stated that the general organized the defense and basically disrupted the offensive operation. And thus, he didn't let the Russians advance into the Kharkiv region. That's why the military calls Drapatyi the front's troubleshooter. So he puts out the most dangerous hotspots. It was Drapatyi, and this is telling, whom Syrskyi regularly redeployed to the most problematic areas. Kherson region, Kharkiv region, Luhansk sector. Basically, wherever heavy fighting broke out, that's where Drapatyi was sent to save the situation. As you can imagine, a commander who is sent where things are on fire is there to stabilize the situation. After all, that's the best kind of commander you can have. And now, such a person is leading the entire Ukrainian army. Let me tell you about one particular episode because it best characterizes Drapatyi as a man of honor. And this same episode also highlights that Syrskyi's entire system has completely collapsed today. Since November 2024, Drapatyi has been commanding the ground forces. And on June 1, 2025, he himself submitted his resignation from this post after the night strike on the training ground in the Syrskyi region, where the training unit was located, and unfortunately, soldiers were killed. He didn't try to hide behind his subordinates then. He didn't look for someone to blame. He took responsibility himself and left that post. On June 3, 2025, he was relieved of his position as commander of the ground forces, and he was appointed commander of the joint forces. Well, just compare this behavior with what we've seen in other scandals, and it becomes clear why the army and society wanted him to be appointed as the commander-in-chief. At least that's how it seems to me. A person who voluntarily steps down from his position, taking full responsibility. That's probably a sign of an officer's honor. And here's another telling detail from the story involving Mykhailo Fedorov. The thing is, the former Minister of Defense, remember, on the first day after his resignation, at his briefing, he said that Drapatyi, despite all the successes at the front, despite the fact that Syrskyi sent him to the most difficult parts of the front, despite all that, Drapatyi received as many as 3 reprimands from Syrskyi, because Drapatyi was not loyal to Syrskyi. That is, under the old commander-in-chief, a successful combat general was simply pressured with reprimands. Accordingly, when Syrskyi was replaced by Drapatyi, it's obvious that Syrskyi's whole setup, well, clearly today, has collapsed. Thank you. Let's analyze the other side as well. Why has there been so much dissatisfaction around Alexander Syrskyi that people took to the streets demanding his removal? Well, we have to give credit where it's due. Alexander Syrskyi, a combat general, he really defended Kiev and he recaptured Kharkiv and Kherson regions. These achievements should not be diminished in any way, but nevertheless, people decided that he needed to be removed. Well, first and foremost, it's the nickname the Butcher. In the Ukrainian army and in Western media, Syrskyi has long been called that for his commitment to holding positions at any cost, which critics associate with high personnel losses. This is the reputational burden which has followed him for a very long time, and Ukrainian media, well, as a rule, didn't really dig into it. To use this definition, while Western outlets didn't mince words and said, yes, indeed, Ukrainian troops call their commander-in-chief the Butcher. Second, this is the matter of the Syrskyi regiment. Before that, it was the Skala regiment. In June 2026, the Babel outlet published an investigation, let me briefly remind you, in the 425th Syrskyi Assault Regiment since the end of 2025. By the spring of 2026, at least 26 non-combat deaths of recruits were recorded. 26 people died not in combat but in training units. There are scandals about the fact that allegedly, let me emphasize allegedly, because the investigation is ongoing, the territory of the training grounds was simply mined around the perimeter so that people wouldn't run away. Relatives talked about the lack of medical assistance and violence in this regiment. The film crew from the British TV channel Sky News, who came to film all of this, they were simply shot at by some unknown people. And the general staff ignored all of this and told the Sky News journalists that they shouldn't have gone there. Why did you go there? They went to the training ground, just to remind you. And the military ombudsman, Rishutilova, stated that she was aware of the situation in Syrskyi. They knew about it a year ago, but everyone pretended like, oh, we don't see anything, we don't see any problem. That's why dissatisfaction with the commander-in-chief's decisions was growing, including because of this story. And today, literally, there's news coming out that in May of this year, again, a new recruit died in this very Syrskyi regiment who tried to run away. Third, this is the conflict with Fedorov and the accusation that he's old-school military. Mikhail Fedorov himself at the briefing said that for victory, both Syrskyi and Chief of the General Staff, Gnatov, need to be replaced, because the army needs a different philosophy. That is, an asymmetric war with minimal losses. The focus should be on technology and drones, not on holding positions at any cost, no matter what. Former Azov Chief of Staff Kratovich once made a sharp statement. I'll quote it. The Russians stopped lying within their own army at the beginning of 2024, and we started. I'll note that it was at that time, in February 2024, that Syrskyi became the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. This was a blow specifically to the culture that Kratovich described as always reporting to the top that everything is fine, no matter what, so accordingly. The old generals embody this very culture. It's telling how Syrskyi himself reacted to criticism. When Fedorov spoke about the conflict, Syrskyi responded sarcastically, saying that if it weren't for him, Fedorov wouldn't have been able to do anything at all. He even implied that Fedorov wouldn't have been able to give a briefing in Free Kiev. In this manner, hinting, without directly saying it, reminding everyone that it was he who didn't let the Russians into Kiev. And in his big personal column titled My Work, My Fault on the Miltech portal, he actually stated that about the conflict with Fedorov. He supposedly was surprised to learn. He says, I didn't know we had a conflict. Well, we've already analyzed this column, so I won't dwell on it. If you missed it, go back to the channel, Alexei Pichi, and watch one of the previous episodes. If I'm not mistaken, it's called something like Syrskyi spoke out against the president, or Syrskyi started an attack on the president. And there was his famous phrase, which his opponents later reminded him of. It went like this. I believe in people, not in drones. Although later Syrskyi insisted otherwise, that it was he who created the unmanned systems forces and put Magyar in charge. Magyar. That the picture is quite honest. Syrskyi is certainly not talentless. He is a combat general. All respect, all honor to the general. He saved Kyiv and Kharkiv in 2022, and Zelensky acknowledged this, and Ukrainians acknowledge this. No one is diminishing that in any way, but his military philosophy and the accumulated scandals simply came into conflict with the demands of the army and society for a new generation of commanders. Now a little about Mykhailo Fedorov, because he won't disappear either. Moreover, he will remain in power, and now, together with his favorite general, Drapatyi, in general the situation may really change. Let me note right away, according to my information, nothing has been finally decided about Fedorov yet, and he continues to negotiate with Volodymyr Zelensky. At the time of recording this episode, it's already the night of July 21st. We're moving into July 22nd. Negotiations are taking place in the president's office between Zelensky and Fedorov. Let me briefly remind you, so you don't doubt my words. Back on July 18th, here on this YouTube channel, I said Syrskyi would definitely be removed as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and Zelensky is already searching for and interviewing his replacement. On July 20th, I said that the decision regarding Syrskyi had been finalized. That's it. Although, yes, new information appeared, and we waited another day. But again, let me repeat. I said back on the evening of July 20th that Syrskyi was definitely being removed. Although some people didn't believe me. They wrote in the comments that Pichi is lying. How dare you? You know, all that stuff. So, as of now, Mykhailo Fedorov, he will not be the minister. Minister of Defense? At the moment, he hasn't been returned to this position. This position was given to someone else. Instead, Zelensky offered Fedorov a new position in the government related to the development of the state's technological sector. In the West, such a role is called a Miltech Tsar. It has existed for a very long time, and let me explain in simple terms what it actually is, because we're just not used to something like this. But actually, it's even cooler than a Minister of Defense. I'll explain why. You might think, if it's cooler than the Minister of Defense, why isn't Fedorov rushing to agree to it, given our situation? This term Tsar in the Western political tradition. Well, obviously it's not about monarchy. The term Tsar is informally used to refer to an official. This is given to someone who is granted very broad powers and made solely responsible for a particular major area so that he can manage it. What's important is that it's done without bureaucratic obstacles. Let's put it this way. Let me remind you, remember Elon Musk? He was shaking up the entire government apparatus of the United States of America. He was kind of like a czar. In fact, he was an official, but not exactly, because he wasn't limited by any super strict bureaucratic procedures. If Elon Musk is a bad example, let me give you another example. In the United States of America, there was a COVID czar, that is, a person responsible for fighting the pandemic. Or they had a drug czar, he was responsible for fighting drugs. And often, he responded to events much faster than the bureaucratic apparatus can. The bureaucratic administrative apparatus. Or now, Donald Trump has an anti-immigration czar. I'm sure you've seen him in that nice coat. He goes out together with ICE and disperses protests. Plus, he arrests illegal migrants. Basically, he's that kind of official. He's sort of an official, but at the same time, he's kind of freed from bureaucratic procedures. That's right, and his hands aren't tied at all. Exactly. Miltech Tsar. Military tech Tsar. This is a person who is given complete carte blanche to develop military technologies, in our case for Ukraine. These are drones, unmanned systems, electronic warfare, digitalization of the army, defense startups, and so on and so on. So, to Fedorov, apparently, they are offering him the chance to lead exactly the field in which he made his name. A technological leap in defense, but now not within the narrow confines of the Ministry of Defense, rather at the level of the whole state with sweeping powers. There is certainly logic here. Fedorov is the person who made Ukraine a leader in drone warfare. He set up the production of millions of drones, promoted asymmetric warfare, and so on. And instead of spending Fedorov on all that administrative routine at the Ministry of Defense with all the procurement for Ukrainian soldiers, he is given the role of a driving force of the entire military and technological direction of the country. But actually, Fedorov himself previously said that he was ready to return only as Minister of Defense, and he refused the position of advisor, for example. Whether he will agree to the role of Miltech Tsar is still an open question. Why is it open? The thing is, in Ukrainian political culture, people like that are usually called something specific. An unofficial overseer, and as you can imagine, that already carries a certain stigma and certain consequences. That's why overseers aren't liked here, and explaining to Ukrainians that military tech Tsar is a good thing will be difficult because the word Tsar is in the name. How can you explain to Ukrainians that a Tsar is a good thing? Of course not, it's bad. So in general, it's a matter of political optics. So, in these definitions and how well he'll manage it and whether Western political culture can coexist with Ukrainian political culture in this sense, that's still an open question. Well, the whole last week, let's be honest, it's basically a story about how Ukrainians felt. Like they were in charge in their own country, to some extent. For 6 days, it wasn't some parties or political consultants standing outside the president's office. Not those crazy things people write on Facebook. It was mostly women. All that talk about it being a paid protest is nonsense. How much did they pay you to go out and protest? It was just regular Ukrainians, mostly young people holding cardboard signs. Some were there for fun, others stood up for their beliefs. People laughed at them. They were insulted. But they stood their ground. They came out on principle, so that effective people wouldn't be removed just because of political intrigue. And so that the best would lead the army? The appointment of Drapatyi, it's also about justice, in its simple human sense. Let's put that aside for now. All his military background. Specifically his military background. And let's just remember that this is a man who, in 2014 on what they called the Flying BMP, he was breaking through to the hostages in Mariupol. He was leading people out of encirclement through 160 kilometers of fighting. He voluntarily resigned, taking responsibility for those who died at the training ground. This is the man who went through the entire war, from the bottom. And now he leads the army, so he's not just some appointee, not someone's relative, not a protege of certain people, of semi-criminal structures. Ah no, he's a combat general. The soldiers know him by the call sign Ruben. Once again, since the very beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine, since 2014 he's been in the army. He could have taken an office job long ago, but he didn't. That's why in a country at war I think that means a lot. So, friends, I'll leave it at that. Your opinion, your conclusions, your thoughts on this, be sure to write them in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to my Telegram channel, Drapatyi News, because the news comes out much faster there. The link is in the description of this video. And if you want to show your appreciation for our YouTube channel's work, and you consider our work important and necessary, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.